This is the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello. This is Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. I don't even paying attention to what's going on in the news. Americans really don't seem to know what's going on, but I travel the world. And I was in Argentina, and 3 days ago I was in Zimbabwe. And next week I'll be in Japan. And so the question today is this: what is the next depression? Is the next depression going to be Zimbabwe, or is it going to be Japan? That's the question. So our guest today is an old-time friend, Richard Duncan. He's an author, economist. He's the author of The Dollar Crisis, which came out in 2003. Please get that book. 2011 was The Corruption of Capitalism. We're no longer a capitalist society. And the book is his latest book was 2012 was The New Depression. So that's why we're on this question. Are we Zimbabwe, which is in horrible shape, and Japan, which is in horrible shape? So this is the difference. I got this from Ray Dalio's book, The Big Debt Crisis or something. He says there's two kinds of depression. So if you're in Zimbabwe, you're in a hyperinflation depression. In other words, prices go up every minute of the day. And if you're Japan, prices are coming down every day. So we're going to stay with macro. Are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And the question, since this is an international program, you have to look at yourself. You see, if you're Zimbabwe, the reason you're in hyperinflation is because your debt is not denominated in Zimbabwe dollars. It's denominated in U.S. dollars. Whereas Japan, its debt is denominated in yen. It's internally financed. So because it's yen, they're in deflation. They're afraid of a depression that's just prices are just going to collapse on them. So that house of yours that was $10 million suddenly goes to zero or 10 bucks. Whereas Zimbabwe, an egg was $300 billion. So the question is, are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? Which depression are you going to be in if you're from another country? And like I said, in Argentina, it's going to be Zimbabwe because their debt's financed in dollars. Europe is actually financed in dollars. So we're saying macro watch. And so Richard Duncan is my macro guy. He is always the big picture. He lives in Thailand. And this guy, he's an American, brilliant economist, worked with the IMF and the World Bank. And he sits in Thailand and kind of chuckles at the whole global economy. And I was just having this conversation with Richard a few minutes ago. I said, I was in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe raised interest rates to 70%. I'm going, holy mackerel. How do you survive with 70% interest? At the same moment, this text comes across, and the Fed in America dropped interest rates from 2% to 1.75. What does that mean? So the question is, what's the next depression? Is it inflation? Is it deflation? Are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? It's a very, very important question because the answer to that question will determine what you do next. Any comments, Kim?
Well, I'm excited to talk to Richard because this is a complicated subject, and it really does apply to everybody because Richard and you, Robert, have a very global macro view on the world. So no matter where you live, this is going to be applicable. But the question I think you're asking is, where are we heading? What's next?
A depression either way. We can't get out of this one.
Yeah.
It's not possible.
I remember talking to some people in Zimbabwe several years ago when to borrow money was 120%, and they were business people, and they were still surviving somehow. But so Richard, what I love about Richard, he's an economist, but he keeps it very, very simple. And so welcome, Richard, to the show because we have lots of questions, and I want to get your viewpoint on things.
Hello, Robert and Kim. Hi, thank you very much for having me back on the show. I really appreciate it.
We always love having you on the show.
Love you. So, Richard, can we stay macro? Because your product is called Macro Watch Video, which is a special offer for all listeners to this program. So, and you sit in Thailand, and you sit on the border of China, which is kind of discomforting. But anyway, your view of the world. So the question is, are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And more specific.
So,
wait. Let me ask
yeah.
this. Let me ask this one question, okay? Because years and years ago, when I first met you, you said something I did not understand. I'm still questioning. Japan went into depression because they sold too many products, right? They were selling too many Sony TVs and Toyotas and all that stuff, and too many U.S. dollars went into Japan. Is that correct?
Yes, that blew Japan into a bubble.
And what's wrong with U.S. dollars flowing into Japan? How did that destroy the economy? They've been in basically a depression for 30 years now.
Okay, so to answer you the big question, I think we are much more like Japan than Zimbabwe. And when I say we, I mean the United States and, for that matter, Europe as well. So here's why. So starting back in the 1980s, or even earlier, in fact, the 60s and the 70s, Japan started running these very large trade surpluses with the United States. They sold much more to the U.S. than they bought from the U.S. And those Japanese companies sold their goods in the U.S. They got paid in dollars. They took the dollars back to Japan. They converted them into yen and deposited them in their bank accounts. And so that caused bank deposits in Japan to grow very rapidly. And so what did the banks there do with those deposits? Well, of course, they lent the money out. And that meant that credit expanded very rapidly in Japan. And this went on for a couple of decades. And there was so much credit growth that pretty soon property prices were appreciating so dramatically that by 1989, the gardens around the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were said to be more valuable than California. So we're just talking about a few acres, or less than 100 acres was more valuable than California.
So Richard, hold on. So that's an inflationary kind of depression that this guy is talking about. It gets so expensive that it's hard to live.
That was the inflationary boom, or the asset price bubble boom, during which time the stock prices also inflated until they were all trading on PE multiples of 100 times. And so Japan became enormously wealthy during this credit boom. But around 1990, the corporations couldn't repay all of this debt, and the households couldn't pay mortgages. Individuals had to take out 90-year mortgages. They called them three-generation mortgages just to be able to buy a small little apartment and finance it. And so ultimately that credit bubble popped. And when the credit bubble popped, then there was so much the prices were so high, the prices then started falling. And since then, land prices in Japan have fallen by about 90%. And property prices across the board have fallen very dramatically. And stock prices have fallen. I think the index peaked at 39,000. It fell as low as probably below 7,000, as best I can recall. And so there was an enormous deflationary crash. And there would have been a 1930s-style depression in Japan, but that didn't happen because instead of allowing all of these corporations to fail, the government started borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars every year and running budget deficits ranging between 6% of the GDP per year and 10% of the GDP every year. Massive government borrowing and massive government spending on such an extraordinary scale that the government's debt as a percent of the size of the economy, it increased from about 60% the size of the economy in 1990, now up to 240% the size of the economy. And it was that increase in government borrowing and spending that prevented Japan from having a complete 1930s-style Great Depression. It is true that Japan's economy is no bigger today than it was 30 years ago if you don't adjust for deflation. But it's also true that the people in Japan still have a very nice lifestyle. And for that matter, have not only plenty to eat and plenty to consume with, but also live to be 80, 90, 100 years old. Very long lifespans. So that's what's happened in Japan.
That
was just the beginning of the global bubble story.
Right.
They were the first.
So Richard, when Japan borrowed money, they borrowed yen. They printed their own money.
That's right. The Japanese government would borrow yen and increasingly the Bank of Japan would print yen and help finance that government borrowing.
Okay, so
And right,
so this is what Dalio was saying in his last report, the one I read. He says that if you finance within your own currency, that creates a deflationary depression, whereas Zimbabwe is financing with dollars from outside, which causes inflationary depressions.
well, the case of Zimbabwe, I would say, is in many ways the complete opposite of the case of Japan. Japan was an exporting superpower that was a globally open economy, open to the whole world in terms of its trading. Zimbabwe is a very small economy, closed to the global economy, and it was very badly managed by the government.
If I could just step back, Zimbabwe at one time was called Rhodesia. It was called the breadbasket of Africa. It was under the rule of the British, I think, or the Dutch, wherever they were. But when Mugabe took over in 1990 or 1980, and the African, it's like the ANC in South Africa took over, that was the beginning of the end. But prior to that, Zimbabwe or Rhodesia was one of the richest countries in Africa, but just like Venezuela is one of the richest countries in South America, and a communist or less a more socialist-leaning people take over, and I don't care how rich the country is, if it's mismanaged at the macro level, that's when it collapsed. So Zimbabwe or Rhodesia was a rich country. I want everybody to understand that because I've gone there 4 times now to watch it.
And let me just go back up, make one point here about Japan, and then go back to Zimbabwe. Japan has never recovered from their boom, correct, Richard? They've never really recovered.
They have never had rapid economic growth again since then.
And is that because they keep printing money, which the U.S. is doing and which Europe is doing?
No, I would say that is the largest reason. Well, there are 2 main reasons. One is Japan's population is shrinking. So every year there are fewer people to consume in Japan. So that creates enormous headwinds to make the economy grow. But the second reason is Japan boomed before Taiwan and South Korea and Japan jumped into the game and became extremely competitive. But after South Korea has made the world very tough for Japan. And then once China came into the global economy, it became tougher still for Japan to excel at the things that it had once excelled at due to this enormous competition from these very low-wage countries. So the Japanese corporations have coped the best they can, largely by moving their factories into low-wage countries like China and Thailand and Vietnam and other low-wage countries. But still, Japan's economy is lucky if it grows on average by 1% a year.
But how can you say that when the debt to GDP is 220%?
Yes.
That's like me earning $100,000 a year, but I have $12 million in debt. Well, he's still got $100,000 a year. So that's what I'm talking about here. So it's how you measure the future. So once again, our guest today is Richard Duncan, author, economist. His book, The New Depression: Breakdown the Paper Money Economy, 2012, The Corruption of Capitalism, 2011, The Dollar Crisis, 2003. His website is richardduncaneconomics.com. He is the brilliant author of Macro Watch, a video newsletter. But we're asking the question today, are we Zimbabwe, which is an inflationary depression, or Japan, which is a deflationary depression? And depending upon which country you live in, that's your answer. So when we come back, we're going talking to Richard Duncan. And the question is, what are you living in? Are you living in is your future an inflationary depression like Zimbabwe, or a deflationary depression like Japan?
You're listening to The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie scans the internet for information about questionable land trusts and series LLCs, oftentimes getting bad information from people who have no idea what they're doing. You deserve to work with a reputable company that serves your best interests. Corporate Direct will never sell you more entities than you need. Corporate Direct offers a free 15-minute phone consultation with an incorporating specialist to see if it can help you. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off each and every formation. Call 800-600-1760. That's 800-600-1760. Or visit corporatedirect.com. Corporate Direct is owned by Rich Dad advisor Garrett Sutton.
What is your number one expense in life? Your number one expense. It's taxes. And I've asked the question is, how come there's no financial education in school, but why isn't there education on taxes either? You know, they tell you to save money, which is stupid. They tell you to invest in the stock market, which is stupid. But what they teach you about taxes. So here we have Rich Dad advisor Tom Wheelwright. We're talking about his revision for his book, Tax-Free Wealth. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Robert.
So what's the tax-free wealth about? What's different this time? It's a revised edition.
Well, so what we did was this is the first major tax reform we've had in 30 years, 2017.
Was 86 was the last one?
86 was the last one back when I was in Washington, D.C.
So many guys got wiped out because of that tax change.
They did. They did. It wiped out an entire industry, savings and loans. This new tax law is just as big, but in a very different way. It affects different industries. You know, the tax law is always a series of incentives. And the question is always which incentives and which ones apply to me. And so the key to revising tax-free wealth was what changed so much in this new tax law that we can absolutely take advantage of seriously, the amazing incentives. For example, the bonus depreciation, for example, for real estate is unbelievable. You buy a $1 million apartment, get a $300,000 deduction or more the very first year.
So if you want to make more money and pay less taxes like Donald Trump and myself, get Tom's book, Tax-Free Wealth.
It pays to listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Radio Show.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Once again, you can listen to the Rich Dad Radio Show anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android. And all of our programs are archived. And you can go to richdadradio.com. We archive it for one main reason, is we're only an education company. We don't recommend you invest in anything and all this stuff. But we think our programs are important enough. If you listen to this a second time, you'll gain even more. But more important, if you have friends, family, and business associates, listen to this program. Because what we're talking about was what is the next depression? Are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And just a few days ago, I was in Zimbabwe. And in a few weeks, I'll be in Japan. I was also in Argentina, which my friend, the President Macri, just lost his job there, and they're going socialist. And I was in Argentina, and the people are running in masses from Venezuela. And Venezuela is one of the richest countries in South America. They have more oil than God out there, and they're going broke because of mismanagement. Another thing I heard on the ground in Argentina from people who were running from Venezuela, they said the biggest problem they had was their school teachers came from Cuba. The same thing as in America. We have socialists teaching our kids right now in our school system. So the question is, are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And I was just in Zimbabwe, and this guy said, look at this. Zimbabwe just raised interest rates to 70%. At the same time, my friend Greg Jagger says, look at this. Trump or the Fed just cut interest rates to 1.75. So one country is raising interest rates, the other country is lowering interest rates. So the question, are we Zimbabwe or Japan? And it depends upon your debt. Do you finance your debt internally? Like Japan finances their debt in yen. They print yen, and they can finance their debt. Whereas Zimbabwe needs U.S. dollars or euro or whatever they can get their hands on, right? Nobody will lend them any money. And Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, the richest country in Africa, just the same as Venezuela is the richest country in South America, and they're bankrupt. So our guest today is Richard Duncan. He's been a friend of Rich Dad for years. We speak oftentimes on stages and all this. His website is richardduncaneconomics.com. And he's a special offer. He has a Macro Watch video newsletter for all Rich Dad listeners. You can go to richardduncaneconomics.com, offer coupon code RICH. And his videos are spectacular because you want to see what's going on globally. It's Richard, because he is a classically trained economist, from Vanderbilt and Babson. He's worked with the IMF as well as the World Bank, but he's a very intelligent man. He sits in Thailand and watches this whole thing unfold. Any comments, Kim?
Well, yes. And also on the special offer, if you go to richardduncaneconomics.com and put in the coupon code RICH, you get 50% off of this newsletter, and it's full
the best
of amazing
investment you could make.
Yeah, great information. So, Richard, my question is, you got Zimbabwe, where you got 70% interest rates and inflation. You got Japan, which was deflation, and they're in negative interest rates. So what is the U.S. and Europe? Are they more going Zimbabwe, or are we more going Japan?
Right. So we're more going Japan. We're following, in a sense, in the Japan model. And here's why. The difference between Japan and Europe and the United States on one side, and Zimbabwe and Venezuela and even Argentina on the other side, the three latter countries which are experiencing high rates of inflation or hyperinflation, they're relatively small, but more importantly, largely closed economy. They're not open to global trade in the same extent that Japan, Europe, and the United States are. And also, they're very badly managed economies. They've printed too much money, and these things combined have resulted in disastrous consequences for their currency and very high rates of inflation. But the rest of the world, the big world, the developed countries, are much more in line with the deflationary pressures that Japan has suffered from now for 30 years. And that's because these countries are open to international trade. And as a result, that means they can buy things from countries that sell where workers make $5 a day. So first of all, the global environment is very deflationary, because in a world with free trade, of course, there's going to be downward pressure on wages and on the price of manufactured goods in any of the developed countries where wages are so high relative to the countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, where wages are extremely low. So we're living in a very globally deflationary environment to start with because of the wage differentials. But on top of that, we've had a big credit boom, just like Japan did before us. Japan's credit boom came in the 1970s and 1980s in particular. Well, the U.S. had its massive credit boom in the late 1990s and most of the 2000s until it all blew up in 2008. So since then, after the bubble popped, there have been deflationary pressures stemming from the pop of this big credit bubble. And it's been necessary to prevent a real 1930s-style depression from occurring in the United States. There would have been a 1930s-style depression in the United States if the government hadn't stepped in with these trillion-dollar budget deficits. And since 2008, the government's debt has increased by something like from $6 trillion to $18 trillion. This is debt held by the public. So let's just call it a $12 trillion increase in government debt, about a third of which was financed by paper money creation by the Fed. Now, that was enough stimulus to keep the deflationary pressures at bay. So the economy didn't collapse into a deflationary depression like the 1930s, but we're dependent on this government stimulus to keep us from collapsing into a 1930s-style depression.
You're talking
so there's
about,
a lot of deflationary
which economy are you talking
forces.
about? Are you talking about U.S., Japan, Argentina? I mean, the U.S. is printing the money, right?
Right. So, yes. So after the bubble popped in 2008, the U.S. government prevented a Great Depression because at that point, the households couldn't repay their mortgages, the banks couldn't roll over their debt, and the corporations were all failing. And so had the government not stepped in the same way that the Japanese government stepped in, the U.S. government started borrowing and spending, and that kept the economy from collapsing into a 1930s-style depression. And that's kept us going now for 11 years. But still, we're still dependent on this kind of stimulus. After all, the U.S. government's budget deficit in the first 11 months of this year topped $1 trillion in the first 11 months. So we have massive budget deficits still. And just since we spoke last time, just during the last couple of months, the Fed has once again started reducing interest rates. They've cut interest rates twice. And in Europe, also in early September, the ECB has now relaunched quantitative easing. They had stopped that about a year ago, but now they've relaunched it again to fight deflationary pressures that are weighing on Europe.
And Richard,
so we're much more of a deflationary environment like Japan.
And you were saying at the break that a lot of the slowing too of Europe is because we're a global trading world now, and that China, because China's economy is slowed, so they're not buying as much from Europe or from the U.S., and so that adds to the problem.
Exactly right. So after 2008, that was a real blow to the United States and its ability to buy things from the rest of the world. And at that point, the Chinese government increased the amount of credit they allowed the Chinese banks to extend, and they really revved up the Chinese economy after 2008. And China overtook the United States as the main driver of the global economy. China's economy was growing more than the U.S. economy, not just in percent terms, but in absolute dollar terms, in about 8 out of the last 10 years. So it's been China since 2008 that's been driving the global economy. But now as a result of the trade war, and also China had an enormous economic bubble even before this trade war began, and it was going to run into trouble one way or the other. But the trade war is making things far worse, and now China's economy is slowing very rapidly. So China is buying far less from Europe, Germany in particular. So now Germany is essentially in recession, and much of Europe is verging on recession because of the slowdown that's the result of the slowdown in China. The global economy is verging on recession because China is going into recession.
I think you alluded to this. Do you think you have a suspicion that one of the reasons Trump is causing this trade war is they don't want China to grow? I mean, it's actually personal at this point.
Yes. I mean, at this point, I think that a consensus has emerged, not just within the Trump administration, but really a bipartisan consensus that China has been growing so quickly that if this continues for another decade, they're going to be much more powerful than we are,
right,
and unstoppable.
So it's personal this time. It's a vendetta. It's a fear.
Well, it's an action in the attempt of self-preservation.
Correct.
As a in the effort to retain Americans' global dominance.
I know. So let me ask you this question.
To stop China's rise.
So let me ask you this question, which I don't understand. Like, I didn't understand why so much money going to Japan would be a problem. And today, in all over Europe and Japan, they have negative interest rates, and it looks like the U.S. will soon get there too. How in the world can somebody justify selling a 30-year bond or whatever they do, and they pay you less when you get the money back? How does that make sense, negative interest rates?
Well, of course, it makes a lot of sense from the seller's point of view if you can get away with selling a bond like that. The question is why would anyone buy a bond like that?
But why are they, Richard?
Well, the answer is they're afraid that if they invest in any other thing, they're going to lose more than they will lose if they buy such a bond. For example,
it's like
German government.
That's like that old goofy saying about it's the ugliest person at the ugly person contest or something. What's the worst? You know what I mean? It's the least ugly of the ugliest.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, the German government bond yield on the 10-year German bond is negative 50 basis points. So anyone who buys that, in other words, it's negative half of 1%. So anyone who buys that believes that it's best to just lose half of 1% rather than more than half of 1%.
Is that the attitude?
Because they don't have any other better options available to them.
Wow.
Or
they don't know there's better options.
So Richard Duncan and Macro Watch, you got to sell your Macro Watch video because this is what you talk about, right?
That's right. So yes, these are the issues that I cover in every Macro Watch video. Okay,
and 50% off for all you put the coupon code Rich on there. I tell you what, you guys, you've got it. I've known Richard, I don't know how many years now, almost 20 years. And every time I talk to you, I get more screwed up. No, because it's so massive. And if you get stuck in micro, you miss the macro. Is that correct?
That's right. You have to understand that, first of all, the most important thing to understand about economics and the financial markets in the 21st century is they don't work the way they used to in the past when gold was money. When all the money was backed by gold up until around 1970, there were a certain set of rules that determined what drove the economy and what drove the financial markets. And that's what all the textbooks are right about. But it doesn't work that way anymore. There is a new set of rules now that money is no longer backed by gold, and you need to learn these rules if you're going to survive and prosper in this completely new economic environment in which we live.
In the new economic environment, you're saying that losing money on an investment is like accepted now. A guaranteed loss is the new normal. Are you just saying? I mean, we're all about financial education here, and they think that's a good investment.
Well, so what that reflects is bad decision making on the part of the German government. The German government now, as I said, it would be a great idea for them to sell a bond and actually get paid for selling the bond, right?
Yeah.
So they need to sell more bonds and take that money and invest it in new industries and new technologies that will make the German economy even more prosperous in the decades ahead. And if they sold more government bonds, then the yield would no longer be negative. I mean, there'd be more supply of bonds, and that would push up the bond yields. And so the yields wouldn't be negative anymore. So this just reflects bad policy making on the part of the German government that yields are negative. The government should borrow more and invest more, and the yields wouldn't be negative.
Yeah,
and everybody would be happier.
Richard, and Kim and I spent a lot of time in our favorite place, Grace. And when we were there before all of this trash broke out, they said they had, we'll talk to the Greek people, they said they had no problem with that before they had credit cards.
Yeah, that's right.
They said, we were
That's right.
fine.
It was a cash society.
And if they ran out of cash, you just stopped spending. And then somebody said, oh, here you have a credit card. And the whole economy came down. And so I just heard this thing said, the reason it was Germany who screwed Greece because they gave them too much credit.
Well, and that's true.
I know
Germany
it's true.
had a big trade surplus like Japan did.
I know
but
it's
instead
true.
of keeping all that money in Germany and allowing it to blow Germany's economy into a big bubble like the Japanese bubble, Germany took its trade surplus money and they lent it to Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland and Greenland and blew those countries into bubbles instead.
And Richard, and that's why I'm talking to you today, is how the heck does money make people poorer? Because when I'm in Zimbabwe, I have a friend named Philip Haslam. He's an accountant. And he wrote a book called When Money Destroys Nations. And when you give poor people money, they get poorer. Is that what's happening?
Well, again, I think it just comes down to whether the economy is managed well or managed poorly.
I understand that, but if you give, because we're going to get into, we're going to stay with Richard one more segment, so I ask Robert. But my point here is that in the United States, we're going socialist also. And we have this thing called MMT, modern money theory, helicopter money, or the magical money tree, where we have socialists and communists now running for president of the United States. They want to give free education, free health care, free food, free manicures. And the question, who's going to pay for it all? So we're going the same way. And that's really why you're on this show, because your company is called MacroWatch, not MicroWatch. But we're going to do a third segment with you, and I want you to talk about your crystal ball. But isn't the problem of giving poor people money make the problem worse? Because when I was in Sunday school, it said if you teach a man to fish or woman to fish, they learn to fish. But if you give them fish, it just gets stinky.
But Jesus also said, if a man asks you for his coat, give him your shirt as well.
Yes.
Well, he's not my teacher today. But I'm saying let's get down to micro, because what I see going on is a lot of theft. Everybody is now so desperate for money. I mean, everybody. They're just so desperate for money. Everybody's running for it's I got mine, I'm getting out of here, which is a stock buyback of corporate America. America's corporate debt is now at BBB, which is pre-junk. So the whole world, Richard, including America, our biggest corporations, AT&T, Ford, GE, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, their credit rating is now triple B. That's not good. So when we come back, we'll be talking to you more about that. And again, let's get back to the macro picture. Are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And if I gave you $1 million, would you just get $10 more million in debt, or would you get rich?
And I also want to hear from Richard on his crystal ball and what he sees coming in the future for all of us.
Well, he's in Thailand, which should tell us something.
You're listening to The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie scans the internet for information about questionable land trusts and series LLCs, oftentimes getting bad information from people who have no idea what they're doing. You deserve to work with a reputable company that serves your best interests. Corporate Direct will never sell you more entities than you need. Corporate Direct offers a free 15-minute phone consultation with an incorporating specialist to see if it can help you. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off each and every formation. Call 800-600-1760. That's 800-600-1760. Or visit corporatedirect.com. Corporate Direct is owned by Rich Dad advisor Garrett Sutton.
Financial freedom begins with financial education. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Radio Show.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And the question today is, are we on the eve of depression? Are we going to be Zimbabwe or are we going to be Japan? The two types of depression. And I picked a lot of this up reading Ray Dalio's book. And it's tough reading, but it's really good. So Dalio just said there's two types of depressions, inflationary and deflationary. And then I was listening to a report by the G7. It used to be G8, but they kicked Russia out. But anyway. So it's kind of funny when you think about it. But so Japan is in deflationary. They have to cut interest rates because they want you to borrow to spend money. And I was just in Zimbabwe 3 days ago, and Zimbabwe is in inflationary depression. And I was just talking to Richard and Kim and all this, and everybody out there it's really tragic. Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, the richest country in Africa. And now they call it the breadbasket of Africa, and now it is the basket case of Africa. And the animal population is decimated because they're so starved for protein. They're killing all the animals just to eat. The same with the fish. So I can tell horror stories, but I was just there. At the same time, I was at the table talking to these Zimbabwe guys. They say, look at this. Inflation the interest rate just went to 70%. And my friend Greg Jagger says, look at this. The Fed lowered our rate to 1.75%. So the question is, are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? And the reason the Rich Dad Radio Show is a global program, so the question is, where do you live? And the big thing is, what is your debt denominated in? So Japan's debt is denominated in yen. So when the Central Bank of Japan, the BOJ, Bank of Japan, prints money, they print yen. And Zimbabwe, nobody gives any money anymore, but they were using dollars. And then nobody gives them any credit, so now they're printing more of their phony money. They have a thing called the eco coin. It's a cyber currency, and they're spending it as fast as they can because it's not worth anything. So our guest today is Richard Duncan, author, economist, author of 3 fabulous books, The Dollar Crisis 2003. He was saying the same thing back then. The Corruption of Capitalism. He was saying the same thing back then. And The New Depression, The Breakdown of the Paper Money Economy 2012. We're talking about the same thing again. His website is richardduncaneconomics.com, and the main reason I have him on this program, he has a special offer. It's called the Macro Watch Video, because you cannot talk about this stuff without pictures. So Macro Watch Video is the most important newsletter you guys can get your hands on. I don't make any money on it. And if you put in the coupon code RICH, then you can see what he's talking about, because this is a macro economy, not micro. Any comments, Kim?
Well, Richard, let's just go back to, we're talking about all of the inflation and deflation and what's happening globally, U.S., Europe, all over the world. how do we get out of this mess? Is there a way out of this mess? Are we destined to go into a depression, whether it be inflationary or deflationary?
Well, so the interesting thing is the way we got into this mess to start with is once we no longer backed our money with gold, then the amount of credit that our economic system created in the US, in Europe, and Japan, it just absolutely increased, you could say, exponentially. And after that point, credit growth became the driver of economic growth. The credit had to keep growing year after year. And now we've reached the point where most of the private sector, earlier Robert was mentioning that the corporations are being downgraded. Most of the private sector, they're so heavily indebted, they're having difficulties continuing to borrow more. And so without enough credit growth, that makes the global economy weak. And that causes these deflationary pressures. And that's why I'm suggesting that all of the developed world is like Japan, facing more of a deflationary depression. Now, how do we get out of this? Well, talking of Ray Dalio, he recently also published a couple of very interesting papers on what he called monetary policy 3. He said we're moving to the next phase of monetary policy is quickly approaching. Monetary policy 1 was where the central banks just cut interest rates to stimulate the economy. But once you get to 0%, you can't cut them anymore. So monetary policy 2 then took over. That was quantitative easing, where the central banks print a lot of money and buy government bonds and push up the bond prices and push down the bond yields. But when the bond yields get close to 0%, then that runs out of effectiveness as well. So, and it also causes increasing income inequality because it pushes up asset prices that benefit the top 1% the most. So he's saying that that's about to run out of steam as well. And he believes that we're moving into what he calls monetary policy stage 3, or MP3. In fact, he says it's inevitable. And he also says that he believes that it will be our best policy option going forward. And I think he's right. And what he means by monetary policy 3 is not just that the central bank prints money and pumps it into the financial markets and drives up the stock market and property market, but instead the central bank prints money and coordinates this with the government, which borrows money. The governments will borrow more, have larger budget deficits, and the central bank will create money and finance these deficits. So that will be a coordinated policy between government borrowing and central bank money printing. This is what he's saying. He's not saying that he thinks that he's happy that we've reached this point. He's just saying we have reached this point, and this is our best policy option now.
And that's
so everybody
Richard,
needs to understand this is coming.
Richard,
and we need to think about the best way to do this.
But I just want to give you some credit here. You've been saying this for years, haven't you?
I have been arguing for this for years. Yes, if we can borrow money for free, if the government can borrow money for free, and we need this borrowing to stimulate the economy, then and the central bank can finance it for nothing through printing money without causing any inflation, then that's what we should do. But we shouldn't just waste the money. The government shouldn't borrow the money and throw it out of helicopters. The government should borrow the money and invest it in new industries and new technology.
And this is the key. I mean, this is the key. Is the government smart enough to invest it in new technologies and new industries, or are they just going to play the same old game? How do we make that shift?
Wait, can I add one more thing? Richard takes it one more step. He says, why don't we borrow that money and solve the biggest problems facing us, like cancer and Alzheimer and disease? Don't spend it on weapons and giving the rich more money. Let's spend it to solve the problems facing all of us today. Isn't that what you've been saying for years, Richard?
Right, and Dalio highlights the same problem Kim just did. Are our governments and are we as a society smart enough to spend this money wisely? And therefore, that's why he's making the argument that we better start thinking about how we're going to do this now.
Well, as a pessimist here, Obama did that. It was a company called Solyndra, and they took those billions and ran, of course. You know what I mean? So that's what happens with the government, with a guy like Obama or the Clintons or the Bushes. They give people money. They somehow get feet and run.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about spending free money, I don't care if they waste $1 trillion or $5 trillion, as long as with the $6 trillion they cure all the diseases and reverse aging, so that we can all live happily ever after, forever. and the economy will keep growing and expanding. If we've got free money to work with, then, and if we don't spend it, we're going to have a depression, a deflationary depression. Then let's think how to invest this in the best way. And by the way, it doesn't have to be done by the government itself, the way that NASA was, for instance.
I was just thinking NASA, yeah. Yep, go ahead.
This money could be, the government could raise the money and the Fed could finance it, but the government could then allocate it to the private sector and set up joint venture companies with, say, the 10,000 most promising U.S. entrepreneurs and scientists, with the government keeping a 60% equity stake for providing the money, and the entrepreneurs and scientists keeping a 40% equity stake for managing the company, and let the entrepreneurs manage these companies. And when one of these companies comes up with a cure for diabetes or Alzheimer's or cancer or all three, it can be listed on NASDAQ for $5 trillion, and the taxpayers get to keep 60% of it.
And that's
don't die of cancer.
And Richard, that's what Taiwan did with their chip company, right? The government financed it, and they became Taiwan this, and everybody's happy now.
Well, yes, and of course, all the Japanese corporations had Japanese government support, and the big successful Chinese companies all have massive Chinese government support.
Let me play devil's advocate. Let me play devil's advocate. So did the FHA and all those guys have government, the GSEs, what were they called? Anyway, they did the same thing, and they ran with the money. Solyndra ran with the money. That's what happened.
Well, of course, there are going to be some losses when you make investments in new industries and technologies, but as long as the winners outstrip the losers, then it's going to be win-win for our society.
Yeah,
and meanwhile, we don't have to have a depression.
I just want to be clear, it has been done in the United States. It's not done only. I've watched every time the government gives people money, they grow feet and they run with it. That's my concern.
Let me ask you this, Richard. From a leadership point of view, do we have leaders that can implement this? That's somebody's got to implement it, or some group has got to implement it. Right now, I don't see people out there very concerned about the American people or the European people, as they are more concerned with themselves.
Well, I do think that we are moving in this direction. What we've just discussed and what Ray Dalio is now saying is inevitable, that would have seemed extremely far-fetched 5 years ago. But now Ray Dalio has said this is the way forward. Mm-hmm. And, for instance, the Dutch government has just announced it's planning to invest, I think, 50 billion euros in new industries and technologies to stimulate its economy over the next few years. And the consensus is slowly moving in the direction. I mean, it's like Winston Churchill said, the United States always does the right thing after it's tried every other possible alternative.
Interesting.
So we're running out of other alternatives, and this is the sensible alternative that's left on the table, and it's the one that we're probably going to pursue. And so we should start thinking about how we're going to do it so that we don't waste the money.
Right.
Good point.
And this is exactly what my teacher, Buckminster Fuller, says. He just said, pay people to stay at home. Just give them what they call UBI, Universal Basic Income, and let them just do nothing. So anyway, that kind of bothers me personally because I like to work. But anyway, that's all these different opinions, and that's what the Rich Dad Radio Show is about. The most important thing is please look at the world from macro. Then you can go micro. Most people like micro, and they go sub-micro, and they don't see anything. Again, this whole question is, are we Zimbabwe or are we Japan? What kind of depression are we heading for? Because we are heading for one. Final question, Richard. What's happening in Australia?
So Australia is in trouble because China is in trouble.
Yep.
Australia has been probably the main beneficiary of China's economic boom for the last 30 years because Australia has so many raw materials that they can sell to China, that China uses to manufacture with. And now that China is slowing down, they're buying less from Australia. So Australia's economy is weakening very rapidly.
And again,
they also have a lot of very expensive property,
right,
that potentially could lose value and do damage to their banking system.
Hey, the most important thing is, like, when I met Richard, I remember I was walking in Borders bookstore, which is now gone, and I heard this psst, 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 and it was this little book called The Dollar Crisis, and I picked it up, and that's how I got to talk to Richard. And he's a real young guy. I thought he'd be an old man, but he's a real young guy. So he used to come in via video and talk to our classes about everything he could see going on in the world. And again, classically trained economist from Vanderbilt and Babson, worked with IMF and the World Bank, but he's highly intelligent and now lives on the border of China and Thailand. But anyway, he sits and watches the world from a global macro point of view. And I remember him telling me that when the dollar went into Japan, it blew Japan into a bubble. This is my whole point, ladies and gentlemen. If you give poor people money, they get poor. That's the lesson. So thank you, Richard. Thanks for being part of us.
Thank you, Richard.
And when we
Thank you, Robert and Kim. It's always so much fun and so interesting to talk with you.
Oh, this is the most
Yeah,
is the most
can't
exciting time, huh, Richard? This is so exciting.
There's a lot to watch.
So once again, thank you all for listening to Rich Dad Radio. We'll go back to Ask Robert next time, but we thought this is such an important program today. Most important you can listen to all at this time, because the question is, we're going into depression, but is it going to be Zimbabwe or are we going to be Japan? Thank you for listening.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.